Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Jim. So I think this is about the third year that we've organized this content into a value summit, and we'll have the session this morning and the session this afternoon. So there's about, according to Marielle, about 500 hours of
Can
content.
we start the timer, please?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, there you go, thank you.
Oh, there we go. That's your job. So we've got about 500 hours of content at the meeting, and we thought we'd take about 3 to really focus on some of the stuff that undergirds all the work that the important work that we do. So I have no financial disclosures. So really to talk about this topic and to reduce it down to a 10 or 15 minute blog is really, really tough. So I really want to focus on 4 things. So a couple of terms that you're probably familiar with: macroeconomics, microeconomics. Others that you may not be as familiar with: micro-efficiencies and macro-efficiencies. I'll define them in just a moment. But we really can think about our labs as the inputs to our labs and then the outputs, that which we produce. And from an economic perspective, I think that that's a pretty useful framework. So when we think about this, I'll spend a moment or two talking about the macroeconomics. What is really driving the intense change that we're seeing in our field? Then that's really more of the 30,000-foot view. As we come down to something that we can take home to us, back to our labs, the microeconomics. How are we paid today? How will we be paid tomorrow? Because I think we need to understand that as we're thinking about operations. The efficiencies, the micro-efficiencies, are how you're organizing the care and how you're delivering that locally, because obviously that has to connect with the resources that are coming into play. And then if we go back out to the 30,000-foot view, the macro efficiencies are really how we're structuring our systems of care. And we really have to think about that. The session in this room 45 minutes ago was really about AI and how that's going to change things. So there's a lot of new inputs that we really need to think about. So if we take those 4 concepts from macroeconomics to macro efficiencies, I'll focus in the middle on the things that influence us and directly and the things that we can influence back. So if we just take a quick summary of some of the macroeconomic issues, and this is Mike Main's slide. Mike is going to chair the session this afternoon, but just to kind of frame things again, this is Lyndon Johnson giving the first 2 Medicare cards to Harry Truman and Bess Truman in 1965. And from that, this is a slide I've shown in past years. This is the demographics in 1970, but this is where we are in 2019. So 58 million on Medicare, and we haven't even hit the crest of the wave. So if your labs are busy, if you feel like you're struggling with too many patients, just wait. Okay, this is this is what we're up against in terms of service delivery and so forth. This is the economics. This is just the actuarial reality of what we're going to face over the next 10 years. So we're spending about $58 billion. We will go over close to $1.2 trillion just because of the math if we're providing care the same ways that we have with the increased number of folks. And Medicare sends out a trustees report, which is online, that we can look at, and this slide is probably the most sobering. So as we go from 57, 58 to 82 million by 2030, okay, the problem with that really is what you see on the right side of the screen. Today, we have 3.1 workers who are supporting each beneficiary. That drops to 2.3 at 2030 and stays that way for the next 50 years from an actuarial perspective. So the input function of resources to take care of these patients is going to go down unless there's some major policy change. And this is the issue that none of us are hearing about from the candidates, but it's critically important. The trust fund that supports all in-hospital care, that which comes out of your paycheck each week or each month, goes bankrupt in 2026. And at that point, the revenues that we are paying will fund 91% of hospital-based volumes. Now, most hospitals off of Medicare today, Medicare pays about 90% of hospital costs. Most hospitals are living off of private insurance. There's some, about 25%, that are actually able to make a go of it on Medicare. But now this is Medicare hospital rates dropping another 9 or 10%. So this is what we're up against in the coming years. So it influences how we're paid today and how we're going to be paid tomorrow. So when we're thinking about the Echo Lab, I think it's useful to think about it in 2 ways. You've got payments on the inpatient side, you've got payments on the outpatient side. So if we just take a look at the outpatient side, just so that everybody is on the same page, there are two different systems by which we get paid. If your lab is organized under a hospital license, it's a hospital outpatient department, there's a fee schedule called the HOPS or the OPS. And in that schedule, there's a certain set of payment rates. And every procedure that we do, and I'll go through this in just a moment, is linked to what's called an ambulatory payment classification. And in that family, everything that's in that family gets paid the same amount for all the technical work. If you are organized in an independent physician's office, not related to a hospital, you're paid under the physician's fee schedule. So there's two different schedules for arguably the same service. So how does that play out? Well, if you look at the OPS, okay, 93306 is APC 5524. That's level 4 imaging. That's assuming that we didn't use contrast in the study. The payment rate for the technical aspect, not the professional read, but the technical performance of the study, all the resources, so forth, today is $493.69. Used to be $449.68 a couple of years ago. Interestingly, look what happens for that same service in the outpatient realm. Okay, was $166, now $135. So over a $300 difference for the same study, just depending on site of service. So is there any surprise that we see 85% of cardiology practices now organized in healthcare systems to arbitrage this difference? Okay, so this is something that's been playing out over the last 5 to 10 years or so, and those labs that are organized under physician's fee service know this very, very well. So we've seen in the last 2 years almost a 10% rise in echo in the hospital-based systems, which is fortunate for those operations, but on the practice side, you can see the challenges. Because I promise you, your cost for performing or the cost back to practice have certainly not been reduced by 20%. When we think about it, there's also another dimension, and that comes back to the patient. Because if the patient has insurance, typically what will happen when the echocardiogram is performed in a hospital outpatient department, then the copay has something to do with their hospital-based copay. And those are usually pretty high. Those can be $500 until you spend that down for the year. Whereas if it's done in an office-based setting, it's the typical office copay, which may be $20. So that puts a lot of pressure on the provider side or the recipient side in terms of what this is going to cost. So this is now leading to a phenomenon in a lot of markets about, appropriately as you would think, about shopping. Is it going to cost me $500 for my echocardiogram, or is it going to cost me $20? So that's another issue that labs are having to contend with. So what happens on the inpatient side? And I think that this is maybe less well recognized. I mean, we all know about the concept of DRGs, and that we're paid basically how care is organized in, if you will, bundles of sort. We'll call them bundles, but basically all the hospital-based care is organized under one payment. I'll go over that in just a moment. So when we take a look at TAVR, so pretty common example. Patient comes in for a TAVR. If that patient has heart failure, renal failure, what have you, with that TAVR, successful TAVR, goes home, the hospital will be paid about $46,000. The expectation for that complex patient is that the patient might be there for 5 days. Patient doesn't have any comorbidities. Patient should go home in 3 days, and the hospital will be paid less. But how much is your lab paid for the echo services you provided, either in the operating room, in the hybrid cath lab, the day after the procedure? That answer is zero, because it's all included in the DRG. Okay? So the physician reading the study will be paid for the professional service, but the amount of resources, time, technical time, and so forth, there's $0 that are coming back to your cost center inside your organization. So it really comes to this reality. Your outpatient lab is a revenue center. Your inpatient lab is a cost center. So we have to really think about it, in that kind of framework. So what do we do about it? So we want to do the right work the right way. So when we talk about costs, there's two distinctions. On the blue side, how Medicare thinks how costly you are, how Aetna thinks how costly you are, is really a function of your charges. How much did you charge them for what you did? And that's important and that's relevant. But frankly, for Medicare, they tell us what our charges are going to be. It's just how many times we do echoes and so forth. But the other side, and this is where it really comes home to roost, back in complex healthcare systems, your true costs to provide care are what the administrative team back at your hospital are thinking about. That is your variable cost to produce your product. Okay, and that's where all the attention is. So there's so much attention back at home on labor and productivity because in the hospital, the one tool that they have really to sort of organize care is around labor. Okay, 60% of discretionary hospital spending is going to be on labor costs. So that's going to be how your lab is staffed, right? That's where all the pressure comes into play. So there will be indexes like a labor expense index and a productivity index, which I'll go through very quickly. So this is a curve from our lab from a period of time. And we're supposed to be between those bands. If we're below the red, we're not productive. If we're above, we're kind of revving a little bit too high. But all of this is based upon what the expectations were of the budget that was set last year versus what we did this week. And that's the real world pressures that we face in labs. And then that will lead to examinations. Okay, well, what's premium labor cost? How much overtime did you have? Did you use contract staffing? All those kinds of things, because obviously there's a lot of pressure to try to tighten that labor curve. So we can look at it, and if we're above 100%, we're doing pretty well. And in fact, in this curve, we can take our labor and our productivity. So when you go back home and you look at your labs and ask, how things are being evaluated, there will probably be some sort of curve like this. And if you tend to be up in this sort of northeast quadrant where your labor expenses are better than you thought that they would be and your productivity is better, people will tend to let your operations just proceed as usual. But you can imagine if you're kind of in that southwest corridor, there's going to be a lot of attention to the operations that are going on back home. So the problem with all of this is it's not linked to revenue. It's linked totally to work expectations per unit service. So what's the trick here? And I was having this conversation with one of the sonographers earlier in the meeting. So rather than linking these payments to the actual complexity and such of the work that we do, more often than not, it's linked to some defined unit, like a CPT code, right? So 93306 is one CPT code, right? A limited echo 93308 with color Doppler and pulse Doppler is 3 CPT codes, right? So you can see how all of a sudden the math is just upside down because it's obviously takes more time to do a 93306 for one code, and you can bang out limited studies for 3 codes and look like you're really productive. And this is the dilemma. When the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is what happens in terms of how, the reality I think that's going on today in many of the labs. We're also benchmarking to expectations, what we thought budget would be, not necessarily relative to peers. So the consequences of this as we're finishing up is, I think, the reality that a lot of us see. So we'll be penny wise and pound foolish. We won't hire the extra sonographer that we need. We won't staff accordingly because everybody feels chained to these metrics, and that's something that we really have to elevate in terms of intensity. So we'll pay more overtime and we'll pay more labor costs. We still have to get the work done. Service time, there'll be an erosion of quality, there'll be increased, turnover. But then the other reality as well, how many patients do you have today who need an echo on an outpatient who are waiting 3 weeks, 4 weeks? We just heard in the previous talk, 46 weeks in New Zealand, right? That's revenue that your organization isn't realizing because you're doing something else, right? You're doing the bubble study on the 80-year-old who had a stroke, who's in AFib, right? You're going back upstairs to do that study for which you are getting no money, right? So these are the things that we just have to have the honest conversations about as an organization about how we are organizing care. So just a couple of quick things in close. So what are the remedies? If the principles are always pursue better over cheaper, quality over taking the shortcut, remember that any variation that you have is going to lead to cost. And remember that there's revenue out there that is associated with needed and necessary services that a lot of times we're foregoing because we're just not organized the right way. So what's the future look like? The future really will come down to organizing care more towards bundles. All of us hopefully have imaging protocols inside our labs, but as we take that a little bit further, as we really try to narrow the cost curve and move it to the left, make things less expensive, we're going to need to do things like this. This is an example of our care pathway for acute myocardial infarction, and the arrow just shows that that's the box where one gets an echocardiogram, walking through. And as we think about heart failure and AFib and so forth, these are the things that we need to organize, because if we reduce this down to the atomic level of care, we're going to focus on labor and productivity, and that's going to be a fool's errand, as we've seen. So when we do things like this, we can reduce cost of care, we can improve outcomes, because in the future, the outpatient echo lab and the inpatient echo lab are both going to be cost centers. So I'm going to stop there. A couple more slides about macro efficiencies, but you're going to hear that, I think, in the next talk with Ray Stainback about how we reduce low-value care. So I'll stop there. Thank you.